Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Leslie James. I am a lecturer in the School of History, and it's really a pleasure to welcome all of you here. So, first, I would like to invite Roxy Harris to say a few words about and on behalf of the George Padmore Institute.
Good evening. Can you hear me further back? Great, thank you. I'm the current chair of the George Padmore Institute, which I was a founder member of, trustee of, back in 1991 under the leadership of the late John LaRose. Now, obviously, I don't look that old, but I am. I want to thank Chris Moffat for all his efforts to put on the event, and also particular thanks to the head of history, Professor Emma Griffin, for supporting this. We're delighted in the George Padmore Institute at this collaboration, and we hope we'll be able to have other collaborations in the future. I wanted to start off just briefly by giving you something that gets you a sense of what the George Padmore Institute is. And I thought I'd start off by quoting the late John LaRose. He said, "I was born in Arima, a town in Trinidad, a few miles from where George Padmore and C.L.R. James were born. I was born some 3 decades after their birth. In my growing up in that society, they were both legendary figures." So let's just give you a brief sense of a genealogy. Genealogy. And then later he said, George Padmore emerged on the world stage out of the history, or a whole lot of history of the Caribbean and so on, which I have described, to play his role for political and social liberation for Asia, for Africa, for the Americas, including the Caribbean. I sought to perpetuate the memory of George Padmore when I founded the George Padmore Supplementary School in 1969, the first of the black supplementary schools at the beginning of the black education movement in Britain in the 1960s. Years later, 1991, as we intended from the beginning, after long and practical political, cultural, and publishing activity, after years of national and international experience, writing and analysis, we established the George Padmore Institute. So the antecedents of the George Padmore Institute are there in those words of John LaRose. And the George Padmore Institute, we called it based on an activist archive. It was the collection of the materials of people who've been active in all these movements for liberation. And the purpose of the George Padmore Institute to be an archive, educational research and information center housing materials relating mainly to the black community of Caribbean, African, and Asian descent in Britain and continental Europe. Its aims are to organize and sustain an archive, library, educational resource, research and information center to allow the materials in its care to be available for use by interested individuals and groups, both in person at the GPI and through the use of modern storage, retrieval, and communication methods. Education and cultural activities, including conferences, courses, seminars, study programs, talks and readings, and the publication and dissemination of relevant materials. So that's what the George Padmore Institute is. Please visit its website and explore. There's a load of stuff there about what's available, and I hope that you'll find it very useful. Finally, I just wanted to mention something about Walter Rodney. Walter Rodney was inspiration for people of my generation, both in his intellectual work and in his being an activist as well as a scholar. I'll never forget the shock in June 1980 when he was assassinated, and I'll never forget the meeting that John LaRose and others helped to organize, John LaRose, Jessica Huntley, and Eric Huntley, to have a memorial for Walter Rodney. And that meeting is also attended by C.L.R. James and A.M. Babu, who was an ex-minister in the Tanzanian government. So that's my introduction. I'm very much looking forward to the talk from Professor Scott. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So it's a real honor to welcome each of you on behalf of the School of History here at Queen Mary. Thank you to our head of school, Professor Emma Griffin, for rallying the school's resources behind this event. And as a school, I think we're really pleased to be part of this collaboration, to celebrate the George Padmore Institute, and to kind of be part of continuing that spirit of nurturing the resources for thinking about anti-imperialism, anti-racism, and the relationship between politics and culture that the George Padmore Institute has done for decades. Among those here tonight, we have some of our alumni, grad students, undergrad students. We have people who are working on the history of the supplementary schools, which is, what the George Padmore Institute was part of, as well as many others. So it's a real pleasure to be part of this. Some of my students here tonight have read David Scott this week, actually, on our MA History of Political Thought, Black Radical Tradition module, among others. And rather than read you his bio, which you can do on the website if you haven't already on the Eventbrite, I thought I would just say a few words about how his work is and has been useful. So when I started my PhD in 2008, all of the grad students that I was engaging with had read Conscripts of Modernity, one of his works. And that was really energizing to think about how we can ask questions differently in different historical moments. And as a historian, I think David Scott's work has helped think about historical practice, has helped me think about my historical practice a lot, with Omens of Adversity, helping think about how each generation brings their experience to a set of events like the Grenada Revolution or others. So that work has, I think, enabled a lot of historians to think about how they practice. And so with that, we're really looking forward to your talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I speak roughly at this level, can people at the back hear? Yeah, great, thank you. Wow. Thank you very much, Chris and Leslie, first of all, for doing me this honor. It's a very great honor. It's very difficult to put into words the honor of being the inaugural George Padmore lecturer. So thank you very much, and give thanks to the George Padmore Institute for making this event possible. I have such really vivid memories of John LaRose and visiting him in his home and at New Beacon Books. And that's a very, very special part of the history, or the story, the genealogy that I want to, in some form, recollect for us this evening. So thank you. Before I begin the proper story that I want to tell, I had the great privilege this morning of visiting the British Museum, with which you are familiar, obviously. And the exhibition, Hugh Locke's exhibition, What Have We Here, which is a magnificent exhibition, and I think all of you absolutely, absolutely should see it if you haven't already. And Hugh, to my mind, is one of the finest contemporary artists, hands down, anywhere. But as I perused the exhibition, as I walked through, and it's not very large, I mean, it is large in terms of the stuff that Hugh's working with. But you know what's not there? The contemporary Caribbean. The contemporary Caribbeanism, the effect in the contemporary Caribbean of the rationalities and practices of the British Museum and its implications in the story of empire has had a disastrous effect on the colonies and the post-colonies, what that effect is and how that effect is to be represented in the story of something like the British Museum is a story also to tell. And I hope that in the conversations about Hugh's work in this particular exhibition, and Hugh is saying it's just part one of a much wider project, that the question of the contemporary Caribbean emerges in that story as well. The talk that I'm going to read this evening is part of a wider set of agitated ruminations and reflections on Walter Rodney, and in particular on How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which is a text that has come back into my life, and how to think about its return to my life, and how to think about how to live in the present with this text that has a formidable history is what I'm trying to get at here, and in the other essays that form part of an interconnected project, one of a number of projects on my desk at the moment. It's also, there are bits and pieces of this that, you know, some of you might have read or seen or heard elsewhere. And it's probably one of the adverse effects of increasing age, that one ends up repeating oneself. But alas, that is what one does as one tries to figure out what it is one is actually trying to say. So Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa and the Genealogy of the Caribbean Intellectual Tradition. I have been intrigued for some time by C.L.R. James's elusive preface to Beyond the Boundary, in which he poses the following question, a riff, it appears, on Rudyard Kipling's poem, The English Flag. What do they know of cricket, who only cricket know? Part of James's point, I've come to believe, is to evoke a sense of knowing that is often hard to precisely pin down or self-consciously articulate. An intimate sense of knowing what is familiar, what in some relevant sense one knows before one knows that one knows, or indeed how one knows. Not only the way Matthew Bondman, James's childhood working class hero, knows cricket, but the pre-critical way James comes to know it as well, from absorbing it as a 6-year-old perched at his bedroom window. I think of James here as tracking a dimension of knowing that is one characteristic of a cultural and intellectual tradition, in this case, the tradition of which West Indies cricket is a constitutive and normative and enduring part. To my mind, there is a kind of knowing that is distinctive of the modes of knowing and being and belonging of an intellectual tradition, namely, a pre-reflective embodied way of knowing that unfolds in advance of formal acquaintance or specialized learning, and in which social understandings are absorbed into the veins of the sensorium, so to speak, through the irregular socializing processes of the particular forms of life of which that tradition is a representative part. In such an embodied way of knowing, from the social experience of a tradition, we know our pasts without necessarily knowing that we know them. And how we know certain past books and books about certain pasts embedded in the intellectual tradition of a form of life, or how we know pre-reflectively the texts that various books embody, often happens precisely as James suggests in his Kipling-esque remark about cricket. Now, from an from an expressly Caribbean point of view, Walter Rodney's great book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, first published in 1972, strikes me in exactly this way. Though its formal topic is Africa, not the Caribbean, the book belongs wherever else it belongs. To a radical Caribbean, and specifically a radical Black Caribbean intellectual tradition. When How Europe Underdeveloped Africa comes to us, Caribbeans, it does not come to us from an existential outside, say African intellectual traditions. No discerning Caribbean intellectual of any living generation, I venture to think, needs to know the exact stages of its argument or the full range of historical evidence it marshals in order to intuitively know the crux of its preoccupation or sense the movement of its ideas or feel the force of its moral outrage or the overall direction of its political point. This is because when we read How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, we read it less as a completely new discovery than as a situated confirmation of something we already tacitly know, namely the story of a distinctly unjust colonial relationship and its historical legacy in our form of life. In other words, we know the contours of the critical spirit that informs the book's claims before we encounter its specific theoretical and historical substance. And reading it activates a latent Caribbean cultural political unconscious such that its resonance depends not only on what it gives to us, but also on our readiness to receive what it gives to us. One rough and ready way to summarize all this is to say that we know pre-critically the text of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa before we know, as a formal matter of learning, the book itself, because the text has a more internal or embedded connection to the language of the tradition's form of life than the contingent dimension of the book as a physical object. In this sense, Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa is one of those books that exceeds the details of which it is constructed. One of those books whose significance is overdetermined inasmuch as its ambit is wider and richer and more permanent than the sum of any individual substantive claims that it makes. In other words, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa is a Caribbean classic in the sense that it is a keeper of the language of the Caribbean intellectual tradition. And thought of in this way, in this tradition, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa most closely resembles such other notable books as C.L.R. James's The Black Jacobins, Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery, and George Padmore's How Britain Rules Africa, published a generation earlier in the 1930s and 1940s. Indeed, what I aim to explore in what follows are some senses in which Rodney's book is connected to these respective books of James and Williams and Padmore, not merely superficially, not simply emotively, but deeply, conceptually, genealogically, as reflecting one conjunctural moment in a shared and ongoing radical Black Caribbean intellectual tradition. What, though, is the provocation that incites this critical re-engagement with Walter Rodney and specifically How Europe Underdeveloped Africa? I believe that the Caribbean and indeed the Third World 1970s should be the subject of concerted critical rethinking of a sort that it has not so far adequately received. This was an historical conjuncture of considerable intellectual and political ferment. and creative vitality, perhaps the last in living memory. When the character of the decolonization project of the 1940s and the 1950s, and of the sovereign states to which it gave rise in the 1960s, were being decisively reappraised and indeed found wanting by a new generation of intellectuals and artists, among them, of course, Walter Rodney. The Caribbean 1970s, that in a sense opens with October 1968, with the expulsion of Rodney from Jamaica and the formation of the Abeng movement, and closes with the collapse of the Grenada Revolution in October 1983, was a short-lived conjuncture in which the moral and political sensibility of the region as a whole seemed not only significantly enlarged, but also intensified to a pitch of self-consciousness, and in which the values that were to shape our common futures, whether socialist or capitalist, were openly and sometimes discordantly debated. The new generation was inspired less by leaders like Kwame Nkrumah than by figures such as Frantz Fanon, Che Guevara, and Amilcar Cabral, who motivated a new, potentially armed militancy, a new resolve to confront and remove the petty bourgeois and comprador leadership of the neocolonial order, and a keener and livelier appreciation for the cultural idioms of the popular or subaltern classes. Now, to be sure, by the mid to late 1970s, as this conjuncture acquired a more rigid shape, these figures would themselves be superseded by a doctrinaire and vanguardist Marxism-Leninism and a new allegiance to the Soviet Union, but that is another story. This was a profoundly engaged and partisan generation of serious young intellectuals and artists who sacrificed a great deal, some even their lives, in the service of the radical social transformation of the region. In a pronounced way, Walter Rodney is the most iconic of them. And his great book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, is arguably the most vividly representative text of an era of great texts. So how today should we productively engage or re-engage them, Rodney and his book? What meaningful life can we have with them? What strategies of critical reading or rereading ought we to bring to bear on thinking in and for the present about How Europe Underdeveloped Africa and Walter Rodney? Not to be unduly repetitive, but I want to urge that what is called for is an orientation to the practice of criticism that has haunted me for a number of years. This is an orientation that takes social criticism as a practice aimed less at the supposed knowing disclosure of the error of past actors and their writings, than as the opening up of wider and wider circles of clarification, of relevant contrasts between their problem spaces of interpretation and action and ours. This practice of criticism is concerned, I've urged, not with, on the one hand, the rehearsal of the autobiography of that bygone era, that is, the nostalgic retelling of the story of the past in the concepts, ideas, and images in which it authoritatively offered itself, nor, on the other hand, the complacent acceptance of the self-image of the present age and its largely disparaging and dismissive representation of that past. I think that part of what we need is to recognize and integrate into our orientation to criticism. Now, what we need to recognize and integrate into our orientation to criticism are the senses in which, between that past and this present, there stretches a discursive landscape that has potentially changed, and we together with it, and that therefore past meanings and values and aspirations and horizons may no longer be available to us, not only as ways of thinking, but as ways of living. Provisionally, at any rate, I want to think of the needed approach to Rodney and How Europe Underdeveloped Africa as potentially unfolding over a number of interconnected dimensions that might be understood in terms of the following 4 guiding questions. 1, under what relevant description of the present does the re-engagement with Rodney and How Europe Underdeveloped Africa assume special, even urgent significance? 2, how might we reconsider the teleological developmentalism that characterizes the conceptual structure of the book's argument? Can that developmentalism be displaced without destroying the integrity and force of the book? 3, what should we do with the project of socialist revolution that forms the political horizon of the book's aspirations? Does the loss of revolution in the form that idea takes in the book render incoherent its ideas about or its hopes for social change? And finally, 4, what is the intellectual tradition in which Rodney and his book are genealogically embedded? And why should it be important as a practice of criticism to consider them in relation to the conception, significance, and uses of an idea of an intellectual tradition? These 4 questions define the contours of the larger investigation in which I am engaged, in which Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa serves as my object and my window. In this talk, however, it is the last of them that I want to explore. The next section is entitled On the Idea of an Intellectual Tradition and Its Genealogy, and I have chopped out a large number of sections from the longer work of which this talk is extracted. And we can talk about some of the other elements in the Q&A of the why I think the idea of an intellectual tradition is so important, especially for marginalized kinds of historical intellectual traditions. I'm going to be brief. For my purposes here, intellectual traditions are helpfully thought of as discursive regimes of motivated and agonistic and sometimes unceasing argument, concerned with pasts assumed not only to be consequential, but also to be a common possession in some relevant, embodied, and always contested community of identity. An intellectual tradition, therefore, is not a random constellation of ideas, but a more or less organized field of rival interpretations, animated by the characteristic grammars and idioms and rationalities and thematic obsessions and styles of reasoning that make up a distinctive form of life. Such traditions have, of course, a temporal structure, but they are not concerned with the past, strictly speaking. They are about the life of the past in the present, or rather, they are about the warrant of a certain perspective on the past in the present and its guarantee of an assumed or assured path to a future to come. And therefore, insofar as they are vital and dynamic, intellectual traditions are about the continuity of modes of inheritance and of the authorized past in the present. Such traditions are vivified by the overlapping and successive generations of interlocutors who argue about these consequential pasts and their stakes in the meaning of a common identity, and who seek to establish and sometimes to institute through the normative infrastructures of intellectual practice, circulation, and reproduction, the rationality and the validity of their perspective. Intellectual traditions, therefore, are about power. And in this respect, notably, the idea specifically of a genealogy of an intellectual tradition is not the idea of a practice of critique, if by critique is meant the determination of error, the excavation of the flaws of preceding work, the summary sentences of members of earlier generations of thinkers to the ignominy and of cognitive or theoretical misunderstanding or ignorance or naivety. Rather, the genealogy of an intellectual tradition embodies a practice of reading aimed at disclosing the complexes of prefiguring idioms or tropes that have generated the differently motivated moral political interventions of successive generations of filiated intellectuals in past historical conjunctures. And it aims to read in this way, not for the sake of the past as such, but in order to enable us to form an estimate in a new conjuncture of the prospect of reassembling these prefiguring tropes and idioms of the intellectual tradition for a new challenge of moral political intervention. Toward the genealogy of a Black Caribbean intellectual tradition, it is in some such terms as these that I want to think about the historicity of a specifically Black Caribbean intellectual tradition, and in relation to which I will want to locate Walter Rodney and how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Note, I do not presume that Black traditions are the only ones relevant to a radical Caribbean tradition, or indeed even to Walter Rodney. Obviously, they are not, and those of you who know Rodney's work will know that. However, for purposes of discussing how Europe underdeveloped Africa, it is the question of a specifically Black Caribbean radicalism that matters primarily. Here are questions that orient me. What do we mean, what should we mean by the idea of a Caribbean intellectual tradition? How might we think of the language games that constitute it? What are the prefiguring tropes that constitute the deep structure of the narratives, the story forms that render this tradition distinctive or internally coherent? What are the structures of feeling that animate overlapping and successive generations of intellectuals who find themselves forever arguing with each other over the best way to understand their form of life, its past, its present, and its possible futures? What are the modes of authorization and the criteria for authenticity, for determining who can and who cannot legitimately speak in the tradition's name? What is the dynamic of generational interpolation and identification through which the ongoing modes of transmission and inheritance of Caribbean intellectual traditions unfold? And finally, what are the historical conjunctures of continuity and discontinuity that mark moments of repetition and transformation in the Caribbean intellectual tradition? Like any living tradition, the Black Caribbean intellectual tradition is an embodied and ongoing argument of rival positions over the moral, cultural goods understood to be internal to that tradition. And I take it that the discursive field of this embodied argument is shaped around a distinctive metaphorical allegorical axis animated by a recognizable historical ontology or structure of feeling. As I have argued elsewhere, the Black Caribbean intellectual tradition is underpinned by a prefiguring tropic economy in which the figures of Africa and slavery play a definitive, though ever-changing role. And I'm obviously simplifying massively here. Each of these figures obviously concatenates around itself a whole archive of events and moments that constitute the modern history of the European colonial encounter with Africa, the slave trade and the Middle Passage, and the enslavement of Africans and their descendants on plantations in the Caribbean. That is to say, they are materially embedded in a founding and transgenerational history of unspeakable atrocity and trauma and deracinating domination and the resistance to them. And the historians in the room will undoubtedly know that history far better than I do. But my point is that Africa and slavery are not simply ethnographic or historical realities. They are also metaphoric and metonymic realities as well that help discursively to organize or emplot the social imaginary of an origin story of historical identity and community. This social imaginary, needless to say, is never straightforwardly unified. It is not ever, insofar as it is alive and in good order, characterized by complete agreement or consensus. Or rather, if there is a register of tacit agreement that serves as the taken for granted background for the conflicts of interpretation, it is the permanent fact of the immovable common possession of Africa and slavery as what, in effect, the argument and its stakes and implications are about. Consequently, there are not only debates and conflicts of interpretation, but there are also mobile powers embodied in moral political techniques and strategies and infrastructures and institutions that seek to authorize within and across the temporality of generations which interpretation is authentic and why, and to preclude the space for its rivals. In a sense, these rival approaches in the Black Caribbean intellectual tradition have a common aim, namely, to make whole what has been irretrievably broken, to produce a sense of belonging where there has been irreparable rupture. The wound is permanent. It will not heal. It can only be picked over endlessly, painfully, discursively. Take as an example of a productive conflict of interpretation within the Black Caribbean intellectual tradition, one that involves Walter Rodney and how Europe underdeveloped Africa. It is one that I have reflected on before, and I think Leslie circulated this essay on, I can't remember what it's called, something like on the very idea of a black intellectual tradition. But it's an example of a very important conflict of interpretation embedded within the Caribbean intellectual tradition that involves Walter Rodney. In 1973, the Bulletin of the African Studies Association of the West Indies, and those of you interested, as I know you are, Leslie, in sort of Black publications of the past, this is a much neglected but enormously important publication of the early 1970s at the University of the West Indies, Mona, edited at the time by Maureen Warner, later, of course, Maureen Warner Lewis, published a number of responses to Rodney's then just published book. The response I want to briefly pause over is the one written by Edward Kamau Brathwaite, titled provocatively, Dialect and Dialectic. And those of you who haven't read that dossier of essays on how Europe underdeveloped Africa should do so. It's a fascinating set of reflections on Walter's just published book. Brathwaite and Rodney are helpful Caribbean Black radicals to think some contrasts within the Caribbean intellectual tradition, not least because they were Caribbean intellectuals of different generations, different formations, but each with a deep and direct acquaintance with Africa and its cultural politics. I'm going to be brief and perhaps even schematic here. Like the other participants in the discussion, Brathwaite was full of praise for Rodney's book, recognizing it as an innovative intervention. As he expressed it in his inimitable fashion, it is, quote, truly revolutionary scholarship, history as teach, as thought, as verbal bomb and bullet, designed to refute and make the way clear for rightful building, unquote. In particular, Brathwaite saw in Rodney's image of Shaka, the early 19th century king of the Zulu kingdom, and a great symbol of African freedom, the quote, deep set heartbeat of the book, and an example of the compelling wonder of the quote, Guyanese imagination at work in Rodney's book. But Brathwaite nevertheless had some profound doubts about the entire framework within which Rodney conceived the problem of the colonization of Africa, namely its developmentalism, and I will come back to this later. For however humanized Rodney's Hegelian dialectic was, and however sensitized his Marxist progressivism, they remained for Brathwaite mere categories in the schema of a Eurocentric story of modernization that obscured, at best, or mocked, at worst, a deeper understanding of the cultural moral idioms of an authentic African temporality. Over and over, Brathwaite laments in a tone rich with critical irony, and I'm quoting again, "We find our brother trapped within his modernist progressive dialectic, talking about the escalation of African societies from their primitive structures into something newer, more complex, more efficient, that is exploitative of resources, less subsistent, less like their original model," unquote. In other words, in a paradoxical way, Rodney's impressive dialectic had led him to draw a picture of Africa in some vital respects not far different from the colonial or neo-colonial one he aimed to overthrow. Here is how Brathwaite closes his reflections, again characteristically Kamau. "So as much as I appreciate Rodney's thorough breadth of scholarship, his method, and crucially popular technique of communication, I am equally concerned with the book's residual image. If we, the oppressed, cannot have a viable value system, revelatory as well as revolutionary, capable of recouping itself after defeat, like Jamaican Maroons, like Viet Cong." This is 1973. If you can cast, those of you old enough to cast your mind back to that moment, like Viet Cong, where are we? My Maroon comments here concern not this brother's achievement, which quietly shines forth, but the feel and texture of this particular work, the need for some dialect to go along with the dialectic, unquote. Now, needless to say, my concern here is not to urge that in this particular Caribbean conflict of interpretation of the African past, Brathwaite is right and Rodney wrong. Far from it, after all, if Rodney's revolutionary dialectic stood in need of a cultural dose of dialect, one could just as easily have said in those heady days of the Caribbean 1970s that Brathwaite's profound appreciation of the Creole poetics of dialect sorely needed a political regimen of dialectic. My point here, rather, is to illuminate the senses in which Walter Rodney and Kamau Brathwaite together map rival positions within a Black Caribbean intellectual tradition. They are engaged from different conceptual directions and generations in competing interpretations of what is tacitly understood by both to be their common possession, namely the presence of an African past, and that an authoritative reading of that possession has implications for how we should think about the aftermaths of colonial slavery and the place of African culture in the moral shaping of contemporary Black Caribbean identity. The point I want to make here is simply this, that within the history of the Black Caribbean intellectual tradition, across the temporality of its generations and social formations, the prefiguring tropes of Africa and slavery are a permanent inheritance. They may not appear everywhere in exactly the same discursive organization or story form, but they define a discernible structure of repetition or continuity within the ongoing cultural ontology of Black Caribbean identity. Differently mobilized into sometimes competing arguments about the past and the present in different historical conjunctures, they are nevertheless, in a fundamental sense, the recurrent idiom in which Black Caribbean intellectuals argue out the stakes of Caribbean futures. How Europe underdeveloped Africa in a Caribbean intellectual tradition. In the context of these considerations, I want to turn to the more specific question of the location of how Europe underdeveloped Africa in the radical Caribbean intellectual tradition. One important work that illuminatingly develops the idea of Rodney's generational relation to a Caribbean intellectual tradition and its implications for understanding his life and work is Rupert Lewis's Walter Rodney's Intellectual and Political Thought, published in 1998. Lewis's book is a helpful guide for a number of interconnected reasons. To begin with, it is valuable because of Lewis's intimacy with Rodney and his work. Not simply in the sense that he knew Rodney personally and knows the work well. More than this, born in 1947 and thus 5 years younger than Rodney, Lewis belongs in effect to the same post-1938 generation of Anglophone Caribbean intellectuals, the generation that, as I have earlier suggested, grew up in the wake of the labor struggles of the 1930s and the birth of anti-colonial movements during the Cold War era of decolonization, and that came of political age in the post-independence conjuncture of 1968. In contrast to the earlier generation of 1938, Lloyd Best, Sylvia Wynter, George Lamming, Elsa Gavaya, Stuart Hall, Rex Nettleford, what the 1968 generation shared was not only an experience of late colonial discontent, but an acute dissatisfaction with the new independence regimes and a longing for a horizon of immediate and radical social political transformation. Indeed, not only did Lewis know Rodney personally and politically, but as a member of the Workers' Party of Jamaica, he was himself an actor in a Marxist-Leninist political project in middle 1970s Jamaica, with at least comradely connections to Rodney's contemporary Working People's Alliance in Guyana. That's a deliberately vague allusion, and we may, if you like, we can take that up later on. In short, he too is part of a radical Caribbean intellectual tradition, and moreover one who, like Rodney, took the question of Black nationalism and Pan-Africanism with far more seriousness than most of their fellow communists. Most importantly, though, Lewis highlights Rodney's relation to earlier generations of Caribbean intellectuals, among them the usual cast of comrades, C.L.R. James, George Padmore, Eric Williams, and Arthur Lewis, all born in the first decade and a half of the 20th century, and in many ways the inaugural generation of the modern Caribbean intellectual tradition, which gives a sense of the relatively short history of that tradition. Specifically, Lewis sees the contrast between James and Williams on the one hand and Rodney on the other as framed by the colonial question. James and Williams, Lewis suggests, were differently animated by an anti-colonial horizon of expectation. James, a revolutionary Marxist, and Williams, a social democratic nationalist, they nevertheless both saw the Caribbean problem principally in terms of overcoming the colonial state and the achievement of political sovereignty. By contrast, Rodney was shaped by a different and unprecedented order of things. A revolutionary Marxist, in some ways indebted to James, as we know, he was generationally located in relation to a new problem of political power, namely that of the sovereign regimes of the post-colonial states. He saw the Caribbean problem in terms of the neo-colonial extension and transformation of the older paradigm of colonial relations within a new conjuncture of imperialism and the installation within the independent states of brown and Black elites, some willing, as in Guyana, to support a Black authoritarianism cynically masquerading as anti-imperialism. As Lewis puts it, Rodney's problem was to understand why in the Caribbean the, quote, moment of independence was also a moment of recolonization, a fact which he recognized had as much to do with international capitalism and the Cold War political alignments as with the weakness of the social forces in the ex-colonial countries and of their political elites, unquote. I want to build on Lewis's distinction and use it to consider some contrasting ways in which the prefigurative tropic economy of Africa and slavery are mobilized and emplotted across colonial and post-colonial Caribbean generations. And I do so as one way of locating Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Developed Africa as a critical intervention in a specific conjuncture of the Caribbean intellectual tradition. A specific conjuncture, moreover, that is now part of our past. Setting aside the specificities of its historical research and its argument, I want to focus my attention on the general picture of the colonial, neocolonial problem at the center of Rodney's book, because it is this picture, I think, that links it to the generative paradigm of the Caribbean intellectual tradition and the historical rhythms of its successive subversions of the normative self-image of imperialist historiography. Now, the pervasive self-image of imperialist historiography has been that of a Europe whose relations to the worlds it conquered and colonized and exploited from the 15th century onwards is one in which these worlds are not the essential sources of its wealth and splendor, but dispensable, disfigured, and now irrelevant forms of life, which are, moreover, wholly dependent upon it for value and efficacy. Europe likes to picture itself as sui generis, not as being foundationally dependent upon its colonies, upon its colonial and neo-colonial extraction of economic value for the conditions that have made possible its enrichment and distorted form of life. By contrast, stripped of its details, the combative anti-imperialist picture that drives How Europe Underdeveloped Africa shows a structure of shows a structural and mutually constituting relationship of asymmetrical power between Europe and Africa, in which Europe is made historically at Africa's expense. Rodney figures the relationship as an historically determinate and systemic one, in which Europe coercively enriched itself by impoverishing Africa, enabled itself by disabling Africa, developed itself by underdeveloping Africa, not fortuitously, not accidentally, but systematically. I think that in its elementary form, this picture of the colonial, neocolonial relation as an asymmetrical structure of ongoing exploiting power is not a new one, but is genealogically embedded in the structure of feeling or language game of the Caribbean intellectual tradition. There is an important sense, I believe, in which every Caribbean intellectual knows this picture before they know or appreciate any specific argument in its favor. They know it the way James suggests Matthew Bondman knew cricket. They knew it before they could spell it, as Stuart Hall might have said. And there is an important sense, too, in which the picture of an unjust colonial relation has motivated, across the generations of Caribbean intellectuals, various radical moral politics over the course of modern, or anyway 20th century, Caribbean history. Take C.L.R. James, who Rupert Lewis identifies as an inaugural figure in the Caribbean intellectual tradition. Readers of the Black Jacobins will readily recall the story of the heroic and tragic agency of Toussaint Louverture that propels its dramatic narrative. The Black Jacobins is prominently the story of how, against the background of extreme tyranny and brutality, and in the face of enormous odds, Louverture led the enslaved in 18th century Saint-Domingue to their emancipation, if not their independence. But James makes another historiographical intervention that is sometimes overlooked. It is one that in fact frames the very opening paragraph of the preface to the first edition of his book. There, James writes, and I quote, "In 1789, the French West Indian colony of San Domingo supplied 2/3 of the overseas trade of France and was the greatest individual market for the European slave trade. It was an integral part of the economic life of the age, the greatest colony in the world, the pride of France and the envy of every other imperialist nation. The whole structure rested on the labor of 500,000 slaves," unquote. Here in brief compass, as staging background rather than overall narrative theme, is the statement of what is self-evident to the Caribbean intellectual tradition, namely, that the elementary structure of the colonial relationship was such that it was less Europe that conferred value on the colonies than the colonies that underwrote the extractive enrichment of Europe. Notice that the prefiguring trope of slavery, it is the prefiguring trope of slavery that commands James's attention. Not that an idea of Africa is absent from the text's cultural political imagination. If James was famously writing in 1938, for the coming African anti-colonial revolution, he was also writing, so to speak, diasporically through a Caribbean anti-slavery one. Of course, as is well known, among the first generation of colonial intellectuals, it was Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery that, with James's help, it is said, set the picture of this colonial relation in its sharpest relief. It is widely known from the so-called Williams debate in the historiography of slavery and abolition that the thesis of capitalism and slavery rests on a number of interconnected claims, that the slavery business drove the development of commercial capitalism in the 17th and 18th centuries and helped to generate the primitive capital accumulation that powered the takeoff of the Industrial Revolution, of industrial capitalism in the 19th century, that slavery constrained the development of industrial capitalism and its ideology of free trade, and this precipitated its decline and justified the rising voices of anti-slavery, and finally that it was the material process, and this material process and not the moral ideology of the abolitionists that was the deciding factor in ending the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1834, 1838. But however these empirical claims are to be adjudicated, and my suspicion is that they will never be settled, the historians in the room notwithstanding, the crucial fact from the point of view of a genealogy of the Caribbean intellectual tradition is that they are one expression of the generative idea that not only did Europe's incalculable enrichment, its storied history of capitalism, derive to a considerable degree from the unjust exploitation of the enslaved in the West Indies, but that Europe's autobiography has been scarcely more than an attempt to disavow or diminish its responsibility for the unspeakable enormity. Again, like James, in Williams's narrative, it is slavery that is the generative prefiguring trope. Africa serves primarily as background, as the source of the labor that feeds the open maw of the plantation economy. George Padmore offers a point of contrast with both James and Williams that nevertheless serves to confirm the Black diasporic structure of feeling of the Caribbean intellectual tradition. For 2 decades, as you know, in cosmopolitan London from the middle 1930s until the 1950s, Padmore was the most significant Pan-Africanist intellectual, writing principally about the colonial conditions in Africa and to a lesser degree, the Caribbean. While Africa is more to the fore, the elementary form of the picture of the colonial relation he advances is much the same as in the work of his contemporaries, James and Williams. Take his book, How Britain Rules Africa, published in 1936, 2 years before the Black Jacobins and 8 before Capitalism and Slavery. This, of course, was Padmore's first book following his break with Moscow and the Comintern in 1934. So far as I am aware, Rodney does not mention How Britain Rules Africa, but it is hard to imagine he was unaware of it, and difficult indeed not to hear a resonant echo of it in the program of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. As often in Padmore's monograph-sized writing, the bulk of the book is devoted to detailed chapters on social, economic, and political conditions of various colonies on the continent, especially British colonial Africa. But in the framing first chapter, again reminiscent of the chronologies of Rodney's book, Padmore offers a periodization of the conquest and partitioning of Africa that falls into 2 spans of time. The slave trade period from the 15th to the late 19th century and connected to the development of mercantile capitalism, and the post-slave trade period from the last decades of the 19th century up to the end of the First World War when Germany lost its African colonies. This is the period of the direct colonization of Africa in the context of the development of monopoly finance capital. In his critical description of Britain's relationship with Africa, Padmore puts his finger on the character of imperialism that motivates the Caribbean intellectual tradition. He writes, quote, "For imperialism is a system of economic political parasitism, carried on by a few highly industrialized and technically well-armed powers living at the expense of the overwhelmingly majority of humanity," unquote. Parasitism, I think, is a precise gloss on the picture of the elementary form of the colonial relation as an asymmetrical structure of extractive exploiting power through which Europe enabled itself by systematically disabling Africa. Now remember that in Lewis's terms, the conjuncture in which James, Williams, and Padmore prefigure the tropic economy of their respective texts as they do, was a specifically colonial one. The predominant question before them, the social fact that constrained their horizon of possibility, turned on the overwhelming presence of the colonial state and its authoritarian, to Padmore, fascist, structure of political threats and exclusions. Each of them engaged the colonial question differently, but nevertheless directly. In James's The Black Jacobins, the tropic economy of the colonial slave relation underwrites an insurrectionary politics of anti-slavery and proto-nationalist African liberation, imagined through a Caribbean event. Whereas in Williams's Capitalism and Slavery, that tropic economy underwrites a liberal democratic politics of Caribbean national sovereignty. In Padmore's How Europe look at that Freudian slip. In Padmore's How Britain Rules Africa, the tropic economy of the colonial relation underwrites an explicit politics of African self-determination. The fact of this horizon is scarcely surprising in retrospect. From the vantage of the 1930s and 1940s, from within the colonial, anti-colonial habitus, even where it might have been possible to imagine the formal end of colonial rule, it was scarcely possible to envisage the character of the state that would emerge in the wake of it. As I have already suggested, born in the 1940s, Rodney's generation was very differently located in a different problem space from that of James, Williams, and Padmore. Rodney's generation grew up within the waning years of colonialism, when it was already clear that the movements for decolonization would amount to little more than a constitutional rearrangement. They were young adults at the beginning of the 1960s, when the promising regionalist ideal, the West Indies Federation, foundered and collapsed on the shoals of expediency and cynicism and deceit, and when the first post-colonial regimes installed a new elite in power. It is this generation that exploded in Jamaica in October 1968 and in Trinidad in February 1970. Indeed, as you know, Rodney was both a trigger and a symbol of this explosion, bringing the neocolonial states into a crisis that dramatically exposed their anti-Black and pro-imperial and pro-capitalist character. This is the context for the development in the 1960s of a militant Caribbean Black power inflected by the cultural radicalism of Rastafari, and the first movements in the 1970s toward the formalization of an organized Caribbean Marxism-Leninism. The Caribbean generation of 1968, therefore, breathed an atmosphere of cultural and political militancy. It was a revolutionary generation for whom the prospect of the socialist capture of state power was not a matter of mere speculation. They presumed that this was a real strategic political possibility, to the point of readying itself for armed struggle. They were motivated by an acute sense of having been betrayed by the generation of their parents to deliver in independence on even the most meager of their promises, and driven by an emboldened sense of entitlement, they were done with the old reformism and gradualism, and with the intemperate self-confidence of youth, they made demands for immediate and radical change. In this respect, Rodney and other members of this generation lived an emerging conjuncture of Caribbean post-colonial politics that neither James nor Padmore nor Williams knew, or certainly not in the way that Rodney knew it, who grew up in 1950s British Guyana and in 1920s Trinidad. This, parenthetically, is one reason why James simply could not fathom the risks that Rodney was willing to take in the service of the overthrow of the neocolonial regime of Forbes Burnham. But it is not that Rodney did not adequately understand the problem of power, as James bemoaned, as much as that the problem of power itself, including the will to take power, were located for Rodney and his generation of revolutionaries in a very different place of tangible aspiration and concrete prospect than it was for James and his. The habitus of Rodney's generation, then, was that of a restless impatience, full of a single-minded resoluteness and dogmatic clarity of purpose. This habitus was significantly underwritten by their formative training in the new political rationalities of knowledge production in the social and historical sciences at the recently opened University College of the West Indies at Mona. Here they imbibed new doctrines that promoted the rational analysis of the structural sources of Caribbean hardship and suffering and conflict, as well as possible rational directions of change. Crucial here was the new doctrine of development and its implications. Unlike what occurs in the Black Jacobins and How Britain Rules Africa or Capitalism and Slavery, in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, the interconnections between Africa, slavery, Europe, and the Caribbean are not only figured in a formatively temporal relationship of power, but in an explicitly developmentalist narrative, as remember Brathwaite lamented. Not, of course, that development was unknown to the earlier generation, to the contrary. Padmore's generation is precisely the generation in which the promotion of development becomes explicit colonial policy. And indeed, much of Padmore's post-war writing, I have been given my voilà. Much of Padmore's post-war writing, as Leslie James has shown, was directed at demonstrating the perverse discrepancy between colonial investment in welfare and development and the enrichment derived from the colonies. But in the 1960s, and from a variety of theorizations of dependency, of which the Caribbean New World movement was one with which, in its early formation, Rodney was intimately connected, development became central to the idiom and purpose of radical discourse. In Marxist or quasi-Marxist terms, development came to be seen as internal to the very rhythms and dynamic of historicity. History as such was now understood as developmental, inasmuch as it was inscribed with a vital schema of stages and a progressive or unilinear direction of movement. And moreover, the systemic nexus of development underdevelopment was seen as defining for the dynamic of imperial capitalist history. In a way then quite outside of the purview of the 1930s and 1940s paradigm of Marxist progressivism, to which James and Padmore, and Williams too, to an extent, subscribed. The rationality of development provided a new paradigm of diagnosis of the historical past and prognosis for a liberated future. Specifically, the 1960s idea of development turned more self-assuredly on a teleological rhythm of historical inevitability that secured the rationality and the justification for the revolutionary socialist project of Rodney and his generation. And I'm closing. This then is the Caribbean conjuncture of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. However, the simple fact of the matter is that much as we can no longer coherently mobilize the prefiguring tropic economy of Africa and slavery in the same way or to the same ends as James or Padmore, or more moderately, Williams did in the 1930s and 1940s, nor can we, Rodney's heirs, coherently mobilize that tropic economy into his 1970s story form of socialist revolution. Whatever our nostalgic longing for the total revolution of that heroic moment, there is no way back to that old conjuncture. The possibility is now foreclosed by the historic dissolution of its material conditions. It belongs, alas, to what Reinhard Koselleck would have called one of our futures past. This, needless to say, is not to imply that the complete exhaustion of the tropic figures that have sustained our intellectual tradition, and that they should consequently be abandoned. Indeed, my central point here, is that we could not, in fact, let that tropic foundation go. The eternal return of the imaginary of Africa and slavery, even if we wanted to do so. For it is simply our inheritance, and therefore our fate, a given constituting dimension of the lived historical ontology of our Caribbean intellectual tradition. Rather, the question that confronts us is whether, in our own conjuncture, in the wake of these successive futures past, whether we can have the courage to recover, discover, to invoke again Stuart, in our tradition, the conceptual resources and the vitality with which to reinvigorate an internally coherent narrative of social transformation. That is, in and through the prefiguring tropes of Africa and slavery, to redescribe the colonial past and now post-colonial pasts in the present, in such a way as to be able to discern and shape the possibility of another alternative moral, political, and social economic future to come. I believe that the answer to this question is yes, and that a possible response will require a re-engagement and redescription of the temporalities and political moralities of both revolution and reparation. I take this up elsewhere in the larger project of which this is a part. Thank you. Thank you. I was going to say at the beginning and failed to say so, and I ask the ancestors for forgiveness, but I was going to ask if I could pour a libation for John LaRose and others. Many thanks. Some rum.
Thank you. Yeah.
And thank you. Thank you guys very much.
So that's
Thank you guys for the honor.
So that's what I was going to say as well. Thank you all for coming and being here today. And please enjoy each other's company out in the foyer.